this question. You're going through this series of questions that Jesus asked. And this is the question that I was given. It's a very provocative question. Now, if you come to my house, we love having people for dinner. So if you ever come to my house, my wife often has a little bit of a moan at me, though, because sometimes I ask people very personal questions. I ask questions that provoke people sometimes, because I like to get below the surface of just, what's the weather like in your area and what do you do for a living? And I actually like to get to know people. Sometimes to get to know people, you have to ask slightly personal questions. And we are in a kind of age where we get very defensive about this, don't we? We don't like provocative questions. But the questions that Jesus asks are provocative. He doesn't shy away from asking them. And they are questions that arrest us, and they cause us to stop, and they must cause us to think deeply about what he's asking. And so when he says, what profit, what possible gain, what possible advantage is it to you if you gain the world and lose your soul, is the question. Now, I'm thankful for the person reading, because I asked to read a little bit more around this topic. This question cannot be taken in isolation. What is the context around this? And I would say that the context is one of a consistent theme of identity. So if you imagine that Peter has just asked, or Jesus has gone to a place where there's multiple religions. In the north, it's out of Judea, it's in Caesarea Philippi, and he's gone to a place and he said, who do people say I am? What's my identity? And Peter says, your identity is you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. This is the first time this has been acknowledged in such a public way by his disciples. Then Jesus is elated by this. He's really amazed by this. Peter, this prophetic insight that you have. Blessed are you, Peter, he says. And then he renames him. He gives him a new identity. You are the rock. Now, I won't get on to that kind of discussion around what that means necessarily. But what are you, the rock? He re-identifies, or he helps Peter understand his own identity. Then Peter gets into huge trouble because he goes from up here to down here by the fact he then says something completely out of place. He says, but when Jesus says, but I am going to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to go down, I'm going to be enthroned on a cross, is what he's saying. Peter says, no. That's not my idea of a Messiah. That's not my idea of the kingdom. My idea is that you're going to be triumphant. You're going to see Rome removed from the state of Judea and Israel become a state again. And Jesus is very, very public in this rebuke. And he literally calls Peter Satan. It's one of the worst rebukes you'll ever see. It is the worst rebuke you'll see or read about Jesus in the Gospels. But it's about identifying who Jesus is and who we are. I would suggest that we have a modern crisis of identity. We can see it manifesting itself in our climate today in Britain. Zygmunt Bauman, in his book Liquid Modernity, says, we've got to the point where individuals must create their own identities, but we have fewer and fewer reference points. And what he means by the reference points is where we've come from, our community, our parents, our family. We have fewer and fewer reference points, and he says this creates a huge amount of pressure, uncertainty, anxiety, and a lack of existential security. That's Zygmunt Bauman. And if you think about it, in the modern West, we are people that have overturned our identities. We used to have traditional identities, quite oppressive if you were female, but in a sense gave us security because our role was assigned to us at birth. This is who you are. This is what you're meant to be doing. Now we've got to the point where we must make our own identity who we are. Dr. Jean Twenge, who wrote a book called The Narcissism Epidemic, she said this: the relentless emphasis on self-focus and self-expression from modern Western identity, combined with the pressure of social media, can result in fragile, performance-driven identities that are vulnerable to external judgment. How often do you see that and hear that? How do you judge me? We are fragile. And as a parent of two boys in their 20s, I love to see the fact that they are confident and they have a stable, and they're not fragile. And I look for that stability, and I look for stability in their identity. So good Jesus, as he's saying, what is our soul? And I would suggest to you our soul, what he's talking about in that question that he asks, is who we truly are, our identity. That's what he's talking about. We have this imagination that a soul is this eternal thing inside of us, and it lasts forever, and our bodies decay. I'm not sure that's actually what Jesus meant in this text. What he's actually saying in verse 25 is if anyone would seek to save their life, the word life there, would lose it. And then he says in verse 26, what profit will you gain if you lose your soul? Soul and life is the same Greek word in this text. It's the word psyche or psyche, where we get the word psychology from in the English language. When the English language uses many words to describe the same thing, you can say there's a richer meaning in this. It's our true identity, our true self. I don't know if you saw that Justin Welby was recently interviewed on The Rest is Politics. Now, I thoroughly recommend watching this podcast. It's a really good podcast. But one of the things that really struck me from Justin Welby is, if you remember, in 2016, he had some revealing news. The Telegraph were about to break a story about his father. His biological father was discovered to be somebody completely different. In many senses, this would unnerve us, wouldn't it? It would, who am I then? If I don't know who my father is, who am I? Justin Welby says this to Alistair Campbell. He says, or he said it to the journalist who was asking, my identity is in Jesus Christ. This doesn't change regardless of my DNA. I know who I am, and God knows who I am. That's a secure identity, and that's where Jesus is asking us to think about this question. I'm going to ask you to bring that other slide up, Mike, which is a picture of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's become a bit of a hero of mine. Have you heard of her, Ayaan Hirsi Ali? No? So, Somalian refugee. This is her speaking with the glasses. She came to Europe in the 1990s from a very oppressive Islamic environment, and she became a refugee. She was educated in Holland. She, a very intelligent woman, became a Dutch politician, was very outspoken about the excesses of Islamic control, particularly in Somalia, and then went to the States and met with Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and became one of the new atheists. Very outspoken against Christianity and Islam, any forms of fundamental religion. She equated Islam and Christianity in the same breath. Guess what? January this year, she's become a Christian. This is Richard Dawkins' head. He's so shocked. He cannot believe that you were a new atheist and you've now... And she explains, I had all this identity. I was this former Muslim. I was this Dutch politician. I became this new atheist. I became this adulation, wrote many books. I had lots of people applauding me. But in the end, she was very depressed. Spiritually bankrupt is the way she described herself. And the therapist that spoke to her said, why don't you try praying? And she did. And this is the result. What is your soul worth? What is your true identity worth? That's what Jesus is saying. What will a man give in exchange for his soul? Your identity, what is it worth? It has value. But if you base your identity on your career, your possessions, perhaps your relationships, perhaps your children or your grandchildren, if you base your identity on that, you can lose your very self in the process. What profit will it be if you gain everything that this world offers and lose your soul? Now, I used to interpret that that very fundamentally, that way of looking at that. I think you may also, if you Google Billy Graham speaking on this subject, you'll know that that's what I thought he was saying, Jesus, was, okay, it's okay to gain the whole world, but be careful that you don't lose your soul in the next life. Anybody interpreted it like that? I don't believe that's what Jesus is saying. We are all, in some way, a lost soul. If we base our identity on wealth, which is what he's saying, you're a lost soul still. It's about now. Irenaeus, the 2nd century church father, said the human identity is rooted in being created in God's image and likeness. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. And Augustine, the 4th century bishop of Hippo, said, "Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." If you want to be my disciples, says Jesus, paradoxically, don't accumulate, give up. Don't seek, but lose. That's what he's saying to them. And you know what? The stability that identity gives you is that it's nothing to do with you. It's not based on your successes or your failures. It's not based on anything temporal. It gives you a stability for your identity, which is that it's God-given. If you want to view the soul's worth, lift your eyes and look to a man hanging on a cross who says the words, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" and then says, "It is finished." Because he brings us to the point where he enters us back into a relationship with God when we trust in him. If you center your life on Christ, you won't lose your soul. In fact, you'll find it. It's not based on successes or failures. It's about his work. You have complete acceptance from him. Let me be clear. Jesus is not saying you shouldn't work hard or strive for success. He's not saying you should withdraw from the world in some kind of monastery. What he's saying is don't make these things the basis of your identity. You are much, much, much more than that. And you are very, very, very valuable. You could live 1,000 lives, and it's still not the worth of your soul. God knows the worth of your soul. His son died for it. Dallas Willard said, "The most important thing in your life is not what you do, it's who you become." Isn't it interesting? We give CVs that list our accomplishments and list our achievements. They don't say anything about who we are becoming. Who we are becoming is the identity that God gives us. So who are you this morning? Who are you? What's your identity? Is it fragile? Is it lost? Being sought in all the wrong places. One of my most favourite movies of 2023 was a movie I thoroughly recommend called The Jesus Revolution. It's about the hippie movement in the 1970s and how Pastor Chuck Smith, a true story, how he was meeting hippies. He thought they were just dirty people and didn't want anything to do with them. And a hippie came to his door one day and knocked on his door and said, "Pastor, my people are like sheep without a shepherd. They're searching for God, but in all the wrong places." And Pastor Chuck Smith changed his view and began to welcome hippies into his church. What are you living for? What's it like? What is that thing that if you lost it, you would have felt you've lost your soul, you've lost yourself? What is that thing that if you lose it, you feel you've lost everything? If it's anything other than Christ, you're at risk of losing your soul. But if you build your identity on Christ, you gain something far greater. An identity that can never be shaken, is never based on your failures, never based on your performance. It's based on the God-given identity of who you are. As Justin Welby said, my identity is in Jesus Christ, not in my DNA. The world says, gain, gain, gain. Jesus says, lose, lose, lose. And you are free to be yourself. May God bless his word to us this morning.